Also coming in here, not guilty. That is the sex trafficking of Cassie Ventura. Count 3, we have guilty. Count 3 is guilty. For the transportation of Cassie Ventura, that is guilty. Count 4, this is the sex trafficking of Jane. That's a pseudonym. Not guilty. Count 5, we have guilty. That is 5 counts. We have a mixed verdict here. Again, count 1, as it relates to racketeering, not guilty. Count 2, as it relates to sex trafficking, not guilty. Count 3, guilty. Count 4, not guilty. Count 5, guilty. Now, we should bring up here, Misty, all of these counts have a range of different sentences, a range of different evidentiary burdens, a range of different outcomes we could have had here. But it is a mixed verdict, if you will.
It's a mixed verdict, but it is a stunning victory for the defense. The Mann Act, these charges, these were the easiest for prosecutors to prove, the lowest hanging fruit, merely required showing that state lines were crossed for the purpose to engage in prostitution. We saw a lot of evidence on these charges, did not have that element, Laura, of force, fraud, or coercion. And this carries the lightest sentence of these charges. It is a maximum of 10 years. And keep in mind, when you're talking about maximums aren't the rule. They are the exception. They're for the most exceptional and severe cases. So now you're talking about a sentence that's potentially in the lower range with time served because he's been behind bars. The fact that these sex trafficking charges, specifically with respect to Cassie Ventura, means that the jury was convinced by the defense, at least with respect to reasonable doubt, that the commercial sex, i.e. the freak-offs, were not connected to some of this violence, that there was not that force, fraud, or coercion element. That is by far, from a penalty perspective, the most serious. It carried a 15-year minimum. So that is a huge distinction. This is the best case scenario, in my view, for the defense. A lot of us opined yesterday that when the jury asked for a readback of Cassie Ventura and Daniel Phillips, one of the escorts' testimony, that read perhaps negatively for the defense. The jury was digging in to see if there was that force, fraud, or coercion. Clearly, it went the other way.
And, it's interesting because the prosecutors had told them you don't have to find force, fraud, or, coercion on every single instance that he did this, right? You only have to find one. It doesn't have to be that this happened every time. But for the racketeering, you really did need to find a pattern of behavior. You needed to find a criminal enterprise that he engaged in with other people, right? When people think of racketeering, they think of the mob. They think of running drugs. They think of running guns. Now, federal prosecutors have used a far more expansive view of racketeering, especially in recent years in SDNY, right? Because
Absolutely.
They want to bring in all of the worst evidence. They want to stretch back the material decades ago. And so you've talked about how it allows them to tell a full story. Well, it turns out doing that in this case did not fulfill what the prosecutors had hoped, because obviously they have now cleared him. They have acquitted him of that top charge of racketeering. They have acquitted him of 2 other charges of using force and fraud, despite having that video, right, Misty? We talked about that video being so damning for him, where you see him on tape pulling Cassie Ventura by the hair. You see him stomping on her. The jury heard evidence that he actually paid money to a security guard to bury that video, paid him in a paper bag, and yet it wasn't enough.
It was not enough. So when it comes to the sex trafficking, yesterday, those questions that the jury asked for the readback with respect to the testimony aligned perfectly to what prosecutors in their closing argument said were 3 very obvious instances of sex trafficking, because they did not have to find that it was the hundreds of times that Cassie Ventura had testified that she engaged in these freak-offs. So prosecutors pointed to these 3. That testimony aligned exactly to that, what the jury wanted to hear. So here's where the defense clearly broke that chain, because what needed to happen was that the jury believes that the commercial sex acts, so those freak-offs, that Cassie Ventura engaged in them because of that violence, because of the force that Combs was exerting, because of extortion about releasing these videos. But what the defense argued was there were lots of other reasons. There was jealousy in the relationship. Yes, there was violence, but it related to these personal romantic relationships that he had with both Cassie and Jane.
As opposed to being part of this masterminding of an enterprise.
And you know what's interesting, Laura? So now we know, we opined about why the jury was not on the same page when it came to RICO. We said, was it because they couldn't agree on a predicate crime, or was it because they just couldn't get there with respect to the idea of this criminal enterprise, which has been very amorphous during the course of this case from prosecutors, hasn't really defined what it is or its purpose. And the answer is, it's that. It's either they didn't believe there was a conspiracy or the enterprise existed. And I say that because the Mann Act, these two charges are predicates for RICO. So if they believed that there had been a criminal enterprise,
that would have been enough.
This would have satisfied the predicate crimes.
So that means they didn't satisfy that.
Hey, thanks for watching. And don't forget,